The cloud came into Alden County on a Tuesday morning in the third week of July, 1937, and it did not come in like weather. Weather has a front edge a man can name. This had a shimmer instead, a gray silver glitter riding high under the sun, and it made a sound the men on the county road would try to describe for the rest of their lives without ever getting it right or dry. Rushing rattle, like rain on a tin roof that never got wet. By 9 o'clock it had settled across the east half of the county. By noon the Hollinger corn, 40 acres of it, stood in ragged sticks. Grasshoppers took the leaves first, then the silks, then the husks, then the green paint off a wagon box and the bark off the fence posts, and when the mass of them lifted again toward evening. The ground they left behind was the color of an old rope. Cars stopped along that road all afternoon, in a stretch of it where cars had no reason to stop. Men stood on their running boards and looked across a woven wire fence at something that took a long moment to believe. On one side, the Hollinger place lay chewed to the fence line. Bare stalks and bare ditch banks and a garden gone down to dirt. On the other side stood corn, green corn, head high, leaf heavy, silked out corn, row after row of it running back toward a low white house and a red-roofed barn, and moving between those rows in a loose and businesslike line were ducks, big ones and small ones, white and gray and pied. Ducks with crests like bad haircuts, and ducks with no two feathers matched, 61 of them all told, working the shaded ground with their heads going down and up like the needles of sewing machines. The woman who owned those ducks stood at her gate with a hazel switch in one hand and a canvas-bound ledger under her arm, and she did not wave at the cars, and she did not smile at them either. Her name was Ida Prather. She was 36 years old, a widow going into her 4th year alone on the quarter section her father had broken, and for the better part of 8 months the coffee drinkers at the Corbett elevator had kept a name for what she was running through that corn. They called it Ida's quacking junk drawer. Harlan Dietz, who weighed grain at the elevator and carried opinions the size of the scale house, had coined it the very day she bought the flock, and it traveled the county all winter, and it was still good for a laugh at the Café Clear into June. The county wasn't using that name anymore. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's begin. 7 months earlier, on the second Saturday of December, 1936, the Vogel place, 4 miles east of Corbett, went under the hammer. It was a foreclosure sale, the third in that township in 2 years, and it drew the crowd. Such sales always drew a few genuine buyers, a great many lookers. And a line of trucks parked nose in against the yard fence like animals at a trough. The bank had a man there in a town overcoat. The auctioneer was Dutch Renner out of Holdrege, a cheerful, hoarse little man who could sell a broken singletree to the man who broke it. And he moved the crowd through the machinery and the good team and the milk cows before the cold got into everybody's boots. The last lot of the day sat behind the granary in a low pen made of crate slats and chicken wire, and nobody had come to the sale on account of it. It was ducks. The Vogel boy had traded for them, swapped for them, and taken them in payment for corn shelling work over 3 seasons, and he had never once sold one, which was the kind of soft-heartedness a farm can carry in a good year and cannot carry in a bad one. There were Muscovies with red-knobbed faces, runners that stood up straight as bottles, 2 fat white pecans, crested birds, cocky colored birds, and a whole muttering middle class of crossbred ducks that belonged to no breed a poultry book would admit to. 61 head. Dutch Renner looked at them a long moment and then looked at the crowd, and being an honest man at bottom, he did not pretend. He asked for $1 for the lot. He got silence. He asked for 6 bits and got a laugh, and the laugh was worse than the silence. It was late, and it was cold, and a rendering man from Kearney was already walking toward his truck, and everybody understood what it meant when a rendering man is the last bidder left on live birds. Ida Prather had come to that sale for a spool of woven wire and a set of harrow teeth, and she had bought the wire, and she was standing at the edge of the crowd with her hands in the pockets of her father's old sheepskin coat. What she did next, she did without hurrying. She raised one hand and bid $3 for the lot, crates and all. And the whole yard turned to look at her the same instant. 60 faces under 60 hat brims, every one of them doing the arithmetic and every one of them getting the same answer. $3 was real money in December of 1936. $3 was a week of groceries. And she had just spent it on the one lot in the sale that the rendering man himself had been about to take away as a favor. Dutch Renner said sold, because that was his job. And in the pause that followed, before the crowd broke up toward the trucks, Harlan Dietz looked over the crate slats at that milling, muttering, mismatched flock. And he delivered the judgment of Alden County in a voice built for carrying across a scale yard. 61 ducks and not 2 of them the same breed, he said. That is not a flock, Ida. That is a junk drawer somebody taught to quack. It got the laugh it was built for. Men repeated it in the trucks going home and repeated it at the elevator Monday. And by Christmas the phrase had shortened and hardened into a name, and the name went everywhere that winter, to the cafe and the sale barn and the barber chair in Corbett. Ida's quacking junk drawer. Nobody said it with real spite. That was the thing about it. It was said with a particular mercy that a county extends to a widow it has decided to feel sorry for, which is a mercy with a smile inside it, and Ida Prather understood the smile better than the men understood it themselves. She loaded the crates onto her truck bed with the Vogel boy helping and not looking at her, and she drove the 4 miles home in the early dark with 61 ducks grumbling behind the cab, and if she said anything to them on that ride, there was nobody along to write it down. What the county did not know, because the county had never asked, was that she had not bought those ducks out of softness. She had bought them because of a report and a book. The report had come out of the state extension office in November, and it had run in the Corbett paper under a small headline, and most men had read it and let it slide off. The papers being full of bad news in those years, and a man only able to carry so much of it. The extension people had spent October walking field margins and roadside ditches across 24 counties, cutting into the packed dirt with trowels, counting what they found. What they found were egg pods, grasshopper eggs laid an inch down in the hard sod of ditch banks and fence rows and overgrazed pasture, 100 pods, and better to the square yard in the worst stretches, each pod holding its 24 eggs, all of it lying quiet under the frost, waiting on one warm spring. The report used the plain words the government used in those days. It said the outlook for the coming season was severe, and the book was her father's. Amos Prather had broken that quarter section out of buffalo grass before the century turned, and he had farmed it for 40 years with a pencil in his shirt pocket, and every evening of those 40 years he had written down what the day had shown him in a canvas-bound ledger he bought in Grand Island for 35 cents. Rain by the 10th of an inch. Frost by the date. The price of hogs, the weight of calves, and along one whole shelf of pages, the summer the hoppers came when he was a young man farming beside his own father, what they ate, what they spared, what worked against them, and what turned out to be wasted labor and wasted money. Ida had that ledger on the kitchen table the night the extension report ran, and she sat with it under the coal oil lamp while the stove ticked, and she read one entry so many times over that she could recite it in the dark. July the 9th. Hoppers 4 to the yard on the ditch bank, going 8 by the 20th. Neighbor Kessler run his turkeys and ducks down his rows morning and evening and lost less than any man on this creek. Birds eat hoppers when hoppers are cold and stupid with dew. The birds did what the bran mash did not. Wrote it here so it be remembered. Wrote it down to be remembered. Her father had been dead 5 years by the time she read those lines by lamplight, and the man named Kessler was dead longer than that, and the turkeys and the ducks of that far-off plague summer were dust and feathers 40 years gone. But an egg survey was saying that the same visitor was coming back, and a dead man's pencil was saying there was a thing that worked against it, and between those two pieces of paper the whole plan stood complete. She did not invent anything. It matters to say so, because the county later talked as if she had conjured something out of the air. Ida Prather never in her life claimed a single idea as her own. She claimed only that she could read, and that she believed what the reading told her, which in that particular winter was more than most of Alden County was prepared to do. She wintered the flock in the south bay of the barn, on straw her own place had grown, behind a partition she knocked together from the same crate slats the ducks had arrived in. Water twice a day, carried steaming from the stove reservoir and poured over the ice in the trough until the trough gave up. Feed was elevator screenings, the cracked kernels and weed seed and chaff that came off the cleaning sieves, and she bought them from Harlan Dietz himself at 40 cents the hundredweight, and he sold them to her with a straight face and told the cafe about it after. And the cafe enjoyed that very much. The junk drawer was eating junk. It was almost too good. She let them laugh, because the screenings were the point. A duck is not a delicate feeder and never has been. A duck is a gleaning animal, an animal built to make something out of the margins of a place, the ditch, the puddle, the spilled roe. The weedy corner and a flock of them will winter fat on what a granary sweeps out its door. Her whole outlay that first winter, feed and all, came to less than $9. She wrote the figure in the ledger on the first page she had ever used after her father's last one, and under it she started the habit she would keep every night through everything that followed. She counted the flock into the barn at dusk, one by one past her knee in the lantern light, and set the tally down with the date. She called it the drag count, because the last 3 or 4 came dragging in from the yard every evening with the put-upon air of schoolboys. 61 at dusk, night after night, a column marching down the page. 61. Now it is worth stopping to say plainly what the rest of the county was doing that same winter, because the rest of the county was not doing nothing, and this story is not honest if the men in it are fools. They were not fools. They were men farming through the driest, meanest decade the plains had handed anybody in living memory. And they were doing what the government and the extension service and their own hard experience told them to do about a hop a year, which was bait, poison bran mash. Bran and molasses and white arsenic mixed in the beds of wagons with scoop shovels, spread at daybreak along the field margins so the hoppers would take it while they fed. The county had a program for it. There was a shed by the fairgrounds where the mixing went on in season, and there were men whose whole June was hauling that gray-green mash out to the townships. And the truth, the fair, full truth, is that the bait worked. Partly, in an ordinary infestation, it knocked the numbers down and saved the middles of a good many fields. The men who trusted it were not trusting a superstition. They were trusting the best tool the times had put in their hands, and the extension circulars said so, and the circulars were right as far as they went. Where the circulars went quiet was at the bottom of the page, and Amos Prather's ledger had already told his daughter what lived down there. Bait killed the hoppers that ate it. It did nothing about the eggs already sleeping in the ditch banks, and nothing about the young ones hatching by the thousand out of ground, too rough to spread mash over, and nothing at all on the days when the wind brought a traveling swarm down out of the northwest that had never tasted your bran and never would. Against those, a man had his prayers. Or, said one dead farmer's pencil, a man had birds. So through January and February, while the cafe polished its joke, Ida Prather sat at her kitchen table with the lamp and the ledger and a school tablet, and she drew her quarter section over and over until the plan lay on the paper as plain as a quilt pattern. The home 80 in corn, same as every year, and running through it and around it, staked out in pencil. A set of long, narrow lanes down both banks of the dredge ditch that crossed her northeast corner along every fence row and straight through the standing corn itself in strips, one strip to every 12 rows. 6 lanes in all. She numbered them, paddock 1 through paddock 6, in her father's habit of numbering things, and beside each one she wrote the 2 times of day that mattered. Morning, while the dew was on, and the hoppers sat cold and stupid on the low leaves, too stiff to jump. And evening, when the cool came back down and pinned them again. In the heat of midday, a hopper is a fast, airborne, contemptuous thing that a duck cannot catch and quits trying to. At 7 in the morning, that same hopper is a wet green raisin on a leaf. And a duck goes down a row, taking them off the stems like a woman picking beans. The fencing began in March, in mud, and it was the fencing that brought the county's amusement to its full ripeness. She built her lane panels out of the woven wire she had bought at the Vogel sale, cut and stapled to cedar stubs, each panel 73 feet long, not for any scientific reason, but because 73 feet was what remained on the spool when she divided the wire by 6 lanes, and she was not a woman to buy new wire while old wire remained. 73 feet, light enough to drag by hand, and she made a dozen of them, and with them she could pen the flock onto any lane on the place and move the whole works before breakfast. Men saw the panels going up from the road. Men slowed down to see them. There went the widow Prather. Fencing duck runs through a cornfield in the worst spring of the worst decade anybody could name, as if corn ground were a thing a person could afford to give over to poultry promenades. Gus Hollinger, whose 40 acres lay against her east line, and who was by no means an unkind man, stopped his truck one noon and watched her staple wire for a while, and shook his head slowly and drove on without a word, and the shake of that head said what the whole township was saying at supper tables from Corbett to the county line. The extension agent came out in April. His name was Mr. Coble, a young man with a clean hat and a government car, and he was polite the whole visit, which in a way was worse. He walked her lanes with her. He looked at the panels and at the flock loafing on the dredge ditch and at the ledger when she offered it, though he read only a page. He allowed that ducks would certainly eat some grasshoppers. He used the word supplementary more than once. He reminded her that the proven measure was the bait program, that the county would be mixing by the 1st of June, and that a woman farming alone ought to think hard before she staked her corn crop on, and here he paused, and chose to be kind on the older methods. He wrote something in a notebook of his own before he drove off, and she never learned what it was, but she could guess its shape. The men at the cafe could guess it too, and did out loud to general satisfaction. What none of them had walked out to see was the thing already written in her ledger by then, in entries dated through that April. She had gone down her own ditch banks with a trowel and a square of lath the way the extension men had done in the fall, cutting the sod, counting under it. Egg pods at the roots of the wheatgrass, an inch down, packed like shotgun shells in a box. 11 pods to the square yard along her north fence. Up to 30 on the south bank of the dredge ditch where the ground lay bare and warm. She wrote the counts down beside the dates, column after column, the arithmetic of the coming summer sleeping in her own dirt. And beside one entry she set down the only sentence from that whole spring that sounds anything like fear. If the book is wrong, it said, I have spent the seed money on feathers. The book was not wrong. The hatch began the last week of May, on a string of hot days after a soft rain, and it began exactly where the trowel had said it would out of the ditch banks and the fence rows and the hard, bare margins. First a scatter of pale nymphs no bigger than oat grains, then a daily thickening, until by the 10th of June a person walking that south ditch bank moved in a low fizz of small bodies. The whole slope alive and hopping ahead of every footstep like spray off a wheel. The men baited. The fairgrounds shed ran its mixers from dark to dark, and the townships hauled mash, and along the sprayed margins the bait did its partial work, the same as it always had. And every morning at 5:30, and every evening at 7, Ida Prather opened the barn, and 61 ducks came down to work. It ran like a small parade, and it never stopped being funny to passing traffic, and she never once cared. The flock had its marching order the whole summer through, and had chosen it themselves, the big red-faced Muscovy drake in front. Then the runners upright and prim as deacons, then the general mob, with the 2 fat pecans invariably last and invariably indignant about it. She walked behind, with the hazel switch she never used on anything but thistles, and the ledger rode in the crook of her arm, and down the numbered lanes they went in their turns. Paddock 1, the north fence row, Mondays and Thursdays. Paddock 5, the ditch banks, every single day, morning and evening both. Because the ditch was the front line and both of them knew it, she from the book and the ducks from appetite. Inside the woven wire panels the flock spread out and went down the strip like a cleaning crew, heads swinging, bills clicking off the low leaves, and the sound of 61 ducks feeding in tall corn, a soft, wet, industrious patter, became the sound of that farm the whole season. As much a part of it as the windmill. She kept the tallies with a schoolteacher's patience. She had cut herself a counting square from lath, a yard on a side, and she would toss it out along a lane, kneel over it, and count what jumped inside it, and set the number down against the date and the paddock. And here was the midpoint of this story, the plain hinge it turns on, and it is not a spectacle. And nobody in the county saw it happen. It is 2 columns of pencil figures on one ledger page, dated the 3rd week of June, 19 37. Roadside ditch, public, unworked, 14 hoppers on the counting square, up from 9 the week before. Her own dredge ditch, paddock 5, third rotation, 3 to the yard, down from 7. Everywhere the ducks walked, the figures fell while the county's figures climbed. The bait lines on her margins were the same bait everyone spread. The difference was working its rows twice a day on webbed feet, and it cost her nothing but screenings, and it was laying eggs besides, big, white, thick, shelled duck eggs she traded in Corbett at a cent apiece over hen eggs. So that by the end of June, the flock had paid its winter feed bill back with the whole plague summer still ahead. Then came the 29th of June, and the evening this story nearly ended. Gus Hollinger baited his East 40 that day, which he had every right to do, and the wind that afternoon came around out of the south, which nobody has ever had the ordering of. His spreader ran the shared line where his stubble met her dredge ditch, and some of that mash nobody ever knew how much carried across and sifted down onto the south bank of Paddock 5. The evening rotation went out at 7, the same as always. By 7:30, the Muscovy drake was down on his breast in the wheatgrass with his wings spread wrong, and 2 of the crossbred hens were staggering in circles with their bills wide. And Ida Prather understood in 1 cold second exactly what had happened and exactly what it meant. Arsenic in the front-line paddock, in the 6th summer of a drought, at the edge of dark. What she did that night, she did alone, because there was nobody to call and no time to call them. She drove the flock off the bank and penned it, and then she went duck by duck through 61 head by lantern light, feeling crops, smelling bills, and every bird that had so much as a sour smell about it she dosed by hand sweet oil and then warm milk with the whites of eggs beaten in. Funneled down with a spoon, one struggling armful at a time, the old poison answer her father's ledger held from the year a neighbor's hogs got into treated seed. She worked until past 2. She did not write the entry until the next night, when the last of the sick ones stood up and cussed her and waddled to the trough, and when she did write it, her hand was steady again. And the words on the page are worth reading out entire. June the 30th. Bait drifted the ditch bank. 9 birds down, none lost. Drag count 61. The count is the crop. The count is the crop. If you want the one sentence this whole story balances on, that is the sentence. But you should know that she wrote it at the end of the worst night of her widowhood, at a kitchen table at 2 in the morning, with her hands smelling of sweet oil and lantern smoke, by a woman who had just spent 7 hours learning what her plan looked like when it lay breast down in the grass. She told nobody. Hollinger never knew that summer what his wind had done, and she never said, because saying would have cost a neighbor and fixed nothing. She moved Paddock 9 feet up the bank, out of drift reach of any line but her own, and she went on. Morning and evening, count and column. 61 in at dusk. July came in white and hot, and the report started moving up the valley ahead of the thing itself, the towns to the southeast one by one, like a man hearing footsteps on a long porch. Hoppers had taken the margins at Riverton. Hoppers were into the corn at Blue Hill. A man at the sale barn had seen a field near Guide Rock go in a day and a half. The men of Alden County baited again, a third time, mixing at the fairgrounds shed through the night runs, and what they mostly said out loud that first week of July was that the traveling swarm might pass wide. And what they mostly knew inside was that a bait line is an argument with an army. And then on the 3rd Tuesday of the month, the argument was over. The shimmer came up the valley on a south wind about 8 in the morning, high at first, a gray gauze pulled across the sun, and men in 5 townships stood out of their porches and looked up and did not say much of anything. And by 9 the front of it was coming down onto the east half of the county with that long dry rattle, and Alden County's Grasshopper year had arrived. You already know what it did, because this story began there. It stripped the Hollinger 40 to sticks by dinner time. It moved through gardens like fire through shocks, took the onions to the ground line, the beans to the wire, and the corn to the stalk, and then took the stalk. It ate the leaves off windbreaks, ate binder twine off standing bundles, gnawed the sweat-salted handles of tools men dropped when they gave up the yard. The bait lines killed hoppers by the bushel at every margin, and the swarm walked over its own dead and kept feeding. Because that is what a plague is, a thing that arithmetic works on, and courage does not. 3 days it hung over that end of the county, thinning and settling and rising, and men stopped fighting it by the second morning and simply stood in their doorways watching their year go, which is a thing a person did quietly in 1937, having by then had a great deal of practice. And on the Prather place, morning and evening of every one of those 3 days, 61 ducks went down the lanes into the storm of it and ate until their crops swung like feed sacks. Let it be told straight, because this channel does not deal in fairy stories, and neither did Ida Prather. The ducks did not stop the swarm. Nothing under heaven stops a swarm. Her outside rows went the same as everybody's outside rows, the west margin chewed ragged, the garden fenced with panels, and saved only by walking the flock through it 4 times a day. A strip along the road lost entirely, gone to sticks. What the ducks had done, they had done in the quiet months before. In the mornings, nobody watched. All that June the flock had eaten the home hatch as it rose out of her own ditch banks and fence rows, so that when the travelers came down out of the sun, there was no resident army already inside her fences to meet them, no second front, no rising of the local ground against her. And when the settlers dropped into the standing corn in their thousands, cold every morning and cold every dusk, the lanes were already cut, the panels were already stacked at the field ends, and twice a day the flock went through like a slow gray comb. A hopper stiff with dew does not jump. A duck does not miss. 61 bills, 2 working shifts, 3 days. The margins went, and the field stood. When the swarm lifted for good on Friday morning and drifted on northwest, the Prather 80 stood green from the lane fences in, silked out and leaf-heavy and breathing, the only standing corn on that road, and men came from as far as 2 townships over just to sit their cars in front of it and look. The whole shape of the thing plain from the road at last, the bare margin, the wire, and then the green wall, with the flock loafing in the shade inside it like an army in barracks. Nobody laughed. That has to be understood in its own weight. There was no scene where anybody was made a fool of, no confrontation at the cafe, no speech. There was just a county full of men standing in stripped fields doing slow arithmetic, and a particular quality of silence that settled over the elevator crowd that August, the silence of men taking an opinion apart quietly, in private, the only place men of that country ever took an opinion apart. The name for the flock disappeared out of the cafe the same week the swarm left. Nobody retired it out loud. It was simply never said again, the town setting it down all together the way a crowd sets down a coffin. The first one across her fence line was 15 years old. Toby Hollinger came walking up her lane on the Sunday after the swarm passed, through the wreck of his father's 40 and the green of her corn, with his cap carried against his chest. And he stood in the yard until she came out, and what he said first was what boys of that country said when they had decided to do a thing on their own hook. "My dad didn't send me," he said. "He doesn't know I'm here." She waited, because she was not a woman who helped a hard sentence along. "Everybody's saying it was luck," the boy said. "The wind, and where they set down, and luck. But I watched you all spring from our side. You was out there at 5:30 every morning of the world. I want to know how you knew. Nobody knows a thing like that ahead. How did you know the ducks would do it?" And Ida Prather went into the house and came back out with the canvas ledger and sat down on the porch step beside a neighbor's boy and opened it flat on her knees to a page 40 years old. That was her answer, the whole of it. She read him the entry in her father's hand, the ditch counts and the dates, the neighbor Kessler and his birds, and the last line her father had set down for whoever came behind him about writing a thing where it would keep. "I didn't know," she said. "My father knew. I just did the believing and the fencing, mostly the fencing." He stayed 2 hours. He copied figures into a school tablet with a pencil she lent him and forgot to take back. And through the shortening weeks of that fall, what Toby Hollinger began, the grown men finished, one truck at a time, each one arriving on some plain errand, a borrowed post auger, a question about screenings, and each one ending up at a fence, hat back, listening, while a widow answered what was asked and offered not one word more. She never gloated. The record on that point is complete and unanimous. She never once spoke of the winter's laughter, never mentioned the name they had used, never in her long life said anything that resembled what she was owed. She showed the ledger to whoever asked to see it, read the counts out loud with the dates to any man who wanted them, and let the pencil do what pride wanted to. Emil Radke, who farmed south of her and had laughed as hard as any man that December, stood at her gate in October with his hat in both hands and put the county's new question to her outright. "Come spring," he said, "would you consider walking them down, our ditch line? The far bank, where the eggs set. We would pay in corn or in work, whichever suits. They can walk it," she said. "Keep your bait off my side of the wire, and we'll get along." By November, there were 4 such arrangements written in the back of the ledger, dated and initialed, the junk drawer of Alden County booked out for the following spring like a threshing crew. The elevator settled its own account in its own coin. She hauled her corn in the first week of November, and it weighed out at 31 bushels the acre in a season when the East Townships averaged under 9, and Harlan Dietz worked the scale himself and wrote her ticket and looked at the figure on it a long moment before he handed it down. Every man on the drive knew what he had called her flock, because every man on the drive had repeated it all winter, and they were all listening. "Well," he said, "I guess the ducks earned their corn." That was the whole apology, and anyone waiting for a longer one does not know the country this story comes from. He said it, and then, because a man does not remodel himself in an afternoon, he added, "I still say the wind gave you some of it. It gave us all the same wind, Harlan," she said, and took her ticket and drove home. It was the nearest thing to a hard word anyone ever heard from her on the subject, and by the standards of what she was owed, it was charity. Mr. Coble came back in late October with his clean hat and his notebook, and this time he read more than a page. He walked the lanes, measured a panel with a steel tape and wrote down 73 feet, copied her paddock schedule and her count columns through 2 full pages of his own book, and dug the dredge ditch's south bank with a trowel while she watched. Where 30 pods a yard had slept the fall before, he found 2. His report went into the state office in December, and it named no names. Government reports being what they are. It spoke of a cooperating farm in Alden County and of supplementary control of grasshoppers by domestic waterfowl on ditch and margin ground, and it recommended, in the flat voice such papers use, that the practice merited wider observation. She kept a carbon of it folded into the back of the ledger for the rest of her life. Not because the government had praised her, for it hadn't quite, because the government had written it down. Written down in her house was what a thing became when it was true. The last entry of that year is dated the 2nd of November, 1937, in pencil, in a hand people said was her father's over again. She wrote it at the kitchen table with the lamp lit and the first hard frost on the glass, and it reads entire. Corn in the crib, 31 bushels the acre. Feed bill for the year, $9.40, paid out of eggs. 4 ditch contracts wrote in the back for spring. Drag count, 61. Wrote it here so it be remembered. Then she closed the book and set it on the shelf above the table, beside the one her father had filled, where the 2 of them stood spine by spine like the first pair of fence posts in a long line. Understand what it was and what it was not. It was not rescue, not restoration, not a miracle. The drought did not break because a widow kept ducks. The Hollinger 40 stayed stripped until frost, the banks went on foreclosing, and the hoppers came back the next year and 2 years after that, the same as they came for everybody. It was just the long, slow, patient work of reading what the dead had troubled to write down, and believing it before the proof came, and walking the rows before sunup every morning of the world, whether anybody laughed or not. The plague took the county's year. It could not take the column of figures that said what worked, and it could not take the flock that proved it. And the proof wintered in her South Bay that year, 61 head, eating screenings, waiting on spring, when half the ditches in the township stood booked for their walking. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told the thing they're counting on isn't worth the feed. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever believed an old book or an old voice when every living soul around you is laughing, I want to hear about it. Every comment gets read.